Hello and welcome to this webinar on new giving tools and vehicles, organised by Alliance Magazine and sponsored by Optimi. My name is Andrew Milner. I'm a freelance writer and researcher, and I'm also the features editor of Alliance, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. The discussion also heralds Alliance's newly launched June issue, the special feature of which is on this very topic, and we're looking to have contributors to the issue among our panelists today. We've got three panelists for you in due course. I'll introduce them as we get to them. We've got Jacqueline Asiimwe from SibSource in Africa. We've got Professor Ray Madoff from Boston College in the US, and we've got Becky Moyo from CAPSI in Southern Africa. Before we hear from them, just let me say a brief word about the format for this event. We're going to run for an hour. Each of the panelists will make a short presentation, and then we'll have a question and answer session, which we'll throw open to all these on the webinar to take part in. If you've attended Alliance webinars before, we're making a slight change to the usual arrangements. We never stand still at Alliance. Instead of using the chat function to put questions to the panelists, we're going to use the Slido function. If you look on the right-hand side of your screen towards the bottom, you'll see a green button marked Slido. And if you click on that, the window will open and you can type your question in there. There's also a clever little icon you can use to upvote other people's questions, which is the technical term, I believe, which moves them higher up the list and makes sure that they get asked. We'll be keeping an eye on this throughout the webinar and selecting questions to put to the panelists during the Q&A. If and when you do ask a question, please tell us who you are and where you're from and whether the question is to a specific panelist. Time's obviously limited, but we'll do our best to put as many of them as we can to our panel. Just to say before we move on, everyone attending today's event is entitled to a 20% discount on an Alliance subscription if you use the code TOOLS23. An Alliance subscription gives you access to 4 quarterly issues of the magazine, including the latest issue on this subject, which came out last week, exclusive subscriber content, and free access to future events. You can find the link to our subscription page in the chat now, and we'll also be following up by email after the event with the offer and recording this event. So again, the code is TOOLS23, but you'll be guided through that if you go to it. You can also join the conversation on Twitter using the handle @AllianceMag and #PhilanthropyTools. Okay, those are the housekeeping announcements, more or less. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our opening speaker from Optimi, who, as I said, have generously sponsored today's event. So I'd like to bring in Christophe Droy from Optimi. He's going to tell us a little bit about what Optimi does and about his own work, I guess. Christophe, welcome.
Yeah, hello, and thank you. So I will not take too much time because we're all looking forward to this discussion to start. So briefly about myself, my name is Christophe. I'm here working for Optimi for a couple of years now. And who are we at Optimi? So foundations, companies, and organizations are doing a great work to make the world a better place. But unfortunately, a big portion of the time is wasted on manual and administrative tasks. And for this reason, we at Optimi, we have developed a grants management system. So we are a technology company. And we want to help to digitize the processes of companies, foundations, and organizations without, of course, losing the personal touch, which is very important in the world of philanthropy and social investment. And furthermore, we want to help to enhance the impact measurement to get the most out of the funds that are invested. Why did we decide to sponsor this event? The reason is very simple. The world of philanthropy and social investment is evolving and growing rapidly, and we are always interested in learning more about the latest trends and also the developments. And we are as well interested in promoting constructive exchanges like the one that we are going to have today. And it's important to learn from each other, as you all certainly agree to. Otherwise, you wouldn't be participating in today's event. And to finish, as the event's topic today is focusing on new giving vehicles and tools, it was an easy decision for us as a technology company that we want to participate. And we are also happy to be able to contribute to the great exchange today. We hope that we will all be learning from this. And I will already hand back the microphone to you. And thanks everyone, and looking forward to the discussion to start.
Thanks, Christophe. That's great. Let's immediately get into the main business, and if we can. So, new giving tools and vehicles. They've obviously proliferated in recent years. The conventional foundation model has been supplanted by the growth of donor advice funds, limited liability companies, and personalised giving services. At the same time, technology is providing more direct means of fundraising and giving, and it's bringing in new people as donors and beneficiaries. Depending on their level of development, different regions have devised their own vehicles. So new means of giving might seem a cause for celebration, but often the new vehicles have attracted as much criticism as praise. Is this fair? What are the implications of these changes and what lies behind them? Is the conventional foundation model being supplanted? Are new means of individual giving transcending classic donor-grantee divides and producing a move towards greater democracy in philanthropy? Conversely, are new institutional forms making philanthropy more opaque? What are the ins and outs of these things? We're hoping to discuss some of these questions this afternoon. And let me move on to my first panelist, who's Jacqueline Asiimwe from SIFSource in Africa. Jacqueline's a lawyer and social justice activist. She's the founder and CEO of SIFSource, which supports the growth and strengthening of local philanthropy across the continent and works to influence philanthropic practice through grant management and advisory services, funding, context, and strategy. Jacqueline's also in the business of shaping narratives about giving and philanthropy within low net worth communities, while promoting the idea that generosity is part of the cultural legacy and social code of all African societies. Jacqueline, welcome. That's particularly interesting. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you do and what your kind of view of the narrative should be?
Good afternoon, Andrew, and thank you so much for that kind introduction. I hope you can all hear me. Just checking. You can hear me, great, thanks. I've seen this thumbs up. So SIFSource Africa is headquartered in Uganda, and we have offices in South Africa as well as in Kenya, or presence, not physical office. And really what we are passionate about around philanthropy are basically three things. One is to influence philanthropy. And so we take part in and curate conversations around decolonizing aid, shifting power, and conversations that advance advocacy for better philanthropy. We are also a philanthropy advisory organization, and by that we mean we advise givers that are external to our context and culture on how to give in culturally responsive ways. And then we also do a lot of homegrown, or rather research on homegrown giving. We tell giving stories through our community podcast and the reports that we generate, and giving stories on our website. And really our passion and mission is to show that giving happens. And I think that for me is my first point, Andrew, that even as we consider new tools, part of the work that SIFSource is doing is to show how giving happens on a spectrum. I think the philanthropy world, which sometimes can be conflated to mostly the Western philanthropy world, has been used to the more formalized structures of giving through setting up of foundations and through grant making. But through our work, and therefore why this conversation is very important, it is to show and to say philanthropy happens on a spectrum, literally from a neighbor helping out a neighbor with salt and sugar when they need to. And so in fact, we call it giving and generosity, because in a sense the word philanthropy has tended to maybe straitjacket or box people into thinking they can't give or they don't have anything to give. What we're trying to say is no, new tools and ways of giving mean exactly that, that you're democratizing philanthropy, that you're seeing philanthropy on a spectrum, and hopefully through that we're expanding the table at which different kinds of people, processes, communities sit at the table together to talk about and think about how to advance their communities through the means of generosity that they have. And then finally, we too do grant making through Civ Fund. And the reason why we set up Civ Fund was our way to show and tell. This is how you do culturally responsive grant making. And we especially foreground dignity, because I think more formal forms of philanthropy have disconnected the person from their community or the person from their passion, from what they really truly want to do, by being directive, by being, we talk about this log frame philanthropy. So for me, in fact, the reason we need the new tools is also to foreground dignity as part and parcel of generosity and giving. So that will be my first, really foregrounding dignity, democratizing who is at the table when we talk about philanthropy. But also, I think the new tools help us show or press the point that philanthropy in and of itself, in order to remain a relevant player in development on our continent, on the globe, it has to be morphing all the time. It has to be changing. It has to be adapting. If I can just give a very brief, like context like ours in Uganda, where it's shrinking space, and maybe the more formalized ways of philanthropy cannot work in a context of social political shrinking space. So of course philanthropy has to keep adapting and shape shifting in order to be relevant, agile, and continually advance good. That's where I'll stop it, Andrew.
Great, thanks, Jackie. Just a point you mentioned a couple of times, culturally responsive giving. Could you just explain a little bit more what you mean by that?
So culturally responsive giving means the giver does not place themselves in the position of all knowing. And unfortunately, that's how a lot of philanthropy has been received on the African continent, right? That the giver, the holder of money, the holder of philanthropic resources is the knower, and they're coming to save, to give to people who do not know quite how to get themselves out of their predicament. So when we say culturally responsive, it's just to acknowledge knowledge does not reside on the side of the giver only. Culturally responsive ways of giving means that, for example, in Africa, where we often say that we are storytellers, we are oral people. When you bring processes that require us to write, of course we're going to fall, fail, and fumble. Does that mean we don't write? Of course we do. Yes, we do. But if we're going to give in culturally responsive ways, we're also going to acknowledge the ways in which people express their ideas and dreams and passions for the communities that they live in. And we're also going to acknowledge that the language is going to be different, because English, French, all these received languages are really not ours. So to be culturally responsive is to hear us in the language that we know, the language of music, of dance, of proverbs, of storytelling. That is culturally responsive giving. And then finally, dignity. There was a sad story that we always tell in Uganda, where there was a giver who was giving, livestock to pigs, actually, to a certain community, and he required that the people that received pigs through his giving had to write his name on the pig. Literally, literally. I'm not even kidding. And so those are the ways in which, when we talk about culturally responsive ways of giving, you do not indignify the person just because you think you have and the other person doesn't. So that's what I mean. That's what we mean when we say culturally responsive ways of giving.
Thanks for that, Jackie. That's a great explanation. Uh, just to go back on, as you mentioned, African societies have very strong traditional forms of generosity. Are you seeing any move to kind of harness these into bigger pools of funding to put more money into one area, or does that really miss the point of this type of giving anyway? This kind of out-of-pocket generosity to neighbours and friends. I mean, I
I
know in certain places you're seeing kind of like,
Yeah,
for instance, you're seeing kind of pooled zakat funding to go to a particular uh, cause, like education or child welfare or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah,
Is that happening in Africa?
Of course it is. It is happening and has happened. When we think about what Rotary clubs do, that is pooled funding. When we think about alumni associations and the giving that they do either to pay school fees or build schools, that is pooled funding. A lot of religious organizations do pooled funding. So pooled funding, yes, has existed, is becoming stronger. In fact, one of the things that we're trying to do as a philanthropy support organization in Uganda through the Uganda Philanthropy Forum is to bring givers round the table to say, how about, would we go further if we collectivized our giving? And so we are exploring that. People have collectivized giving around their ethnicities. So there will be a Buganda cultural giving that is collectivized, or Buchiga, or however we define ourselves ethnically. That too has always happened and is part of it. And so again, if we think about it as a spectrum, and if we think also how it needs to still remain nimble, because like I said in the beginning, when we're working in certain contexts that are politically challenged, formalized giving may not always work. And so it's also to allow people to, for funding to flow and ebb depending on the context, on the time, on who is giving, on the trust building that has to happen when we collectivize our giving.
Great, thanks very much for that, Jackie. It's terrific. Let me move on, because an hour is not a long time, as I'm aware. Let me bring in Ray Madoff. Ray's professor at Boston College Law School, where she teaches and writes on philanthropy policy, taxes, property, and estate planning. She's also co-founder and director of the Boston College Law School Forum on Philanthropy and the Public Good, which is a non-partisan think tank that convenes scholars and practitioners to explore the questions on whether the rules governing the charitable sector best serve the public good. She's also become established as one of the world's leading legal scholars of philanthropy, and is the architect, together with philanthropist John Arnold, of legislative proposals to reform the operation of donor-advised funds. Ray, good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you are. You become sort of famous as the scourge of donor-advised funds, but that's not really the whole story, is it? Could you give your...
Absolutely. I am not an opponent of donor advised funds at all. I actually think that they're an incredibly important vehicle in the charitable landscape. However, if they are going to fit within a legitimate system where we give tax benefits for charitable giving, we have to make sure that they actually produce charitable giving, which is not just the setting money aside, but actually getting money to charities. And that's the problem. It's a lack of regulation of donor advised funds. And I think that's because there's a lot of confusion around what donor advised funds are. And so I'm hoping in my presentation today to lay some groundwork, because it's naturally confusing. People know about private foundations, but donor advised funds are the new kid on the block. And as we'll see in my presentation, there's reason for confusion. So it looks like we're getting started. Okay, so in my comments today, what I'm going to do is go through just some basic overview about what are donor advised funds. Some of our participants might know them well, but a lot of people have seen them but aren't exactly sure how they work, why they're so popular, what issues they raise, and how we can reform the rules around donor advised funds, or DAFs as they're called, to promote the public good. And one thing I want to note is I'm particularly pleased to be speaking before the international audience that Alliance has been able to be a great leader in bringing together, because I think that the United States is seen, by many as a kind of a leader in terms of these formalized forms of philanthropy. And there is a tendency for models from the United States to be adopted in other countries that want to expand their philanthropy. But we have problems within our rules. And I think that what we want to make sure is that our rules are adopted in ways that promote the results that we want. Because if you give tax benefits for charitable giving, but the money doesn't go to charity, then a country ends up depleting its tax base, but not having much to show for it. So that's what we're most interested in when we talk about promoting the public good. We can go to the next slide. All right, so what is a DAF, or a donor advised fund? One of the reasons for the confusions about donor advised funds is because it is two different things. Legally, it is an outright contribution to a public charity. and we call this public charity a sponsoring organization. And legally, it is the exact same as an outright gift to any other charity, like a gift to a food bank, right? So the donor receives all the same tax benefits that the donor would get if they gave it outright to a charity. But when a donor gives outright to a charity in its classic form, the charity then has the ability to use the money for its charitable mission. There's no distinction between giving and getting. However, what the donor advised fund does is it has a separate side agreement with the donor that says, yes, legally, we know we have your money and we can spend it however we want. But don't worry, donor. What we're going to do is we're going to take your money, we're going to put it aside, we're going to keep it in a separate account with your name on it, and you can advise us how to spend the money for charitable purposes and when to spend it for charitable purposes or not, whatever the donor chooses. And also how to invest the funds. So legally, the sponsoring organization has full legal control over the money. They can spend it to redecorate their offices. They can do anything they want with the money. But the way they operate is as if it was the donor's own private foundation type activity. And it's this two faces of DAFs that I think make them both valuable for donors, but also confusing for people who want to understand them, including regulators. Next slide. So who are these public charities acting as DAF sponsors? First of all, any public charity could act as a DAF sponsor. So many charities, like in the United States, universities run their own DAFs because it's simply an outright gift to a public charity that through a side agreement, they agree not to spend for their charitable purpose, but to hold for the donor. Here are some examples. There are in the United States, community foundations are big sponsors of DAFs, but really the biggest ones have taken over since 1991 when Fidelity Charitable, a financial organization, came up with the idea of creating its own public charity through which donors could give their money and they could maintain the funds, give the tax benefits, and basically run it as an account for the donor. Schwab Charitable is another financial institution. National Philanthropic Trust is another big organization, essentially a financial organization. And in the UK, the Charities Aid Foundation is another organization. These are all big DAF sponsors. Next slide. Okay, so why are they so popular for donors? Of course, every country it's different, but in the United States, the reason for the popularity is that we have two sets of rules for tax benefits, one for private foundations and one for public charities, because we want to encourage distributions to public charities. And a contribution to a DAF, as I said, is treated the same for tax purposes as a contribution to the food bank. So you get the maximum tax benefits for the donor while still maintaining functional control over the distribution and management of the funds. So it gives donors the best of both worlds. It's like a foundation without the expense and disclosure, and in the United States, payout rules that apply to private foundations. It's also very valuable because it facilitates donations of property other than cash. So in the United States, you get double tax benefits when you donate appreciated property because you save both capital gains and income taxes. And so it facilitates donations of things like stock, real estate, business interests, and cryptocurrency. Also, it creates the opportunity for people to pass on advisory privileges to children and grandchildren. Sometimes they call this, they say this is a good thing because it's a legacy of giving, but it's also a power dynamic that you're able to pass on. So there's a lot of complexity around this issue. But basically the big issue about a DAF is that the money, you get all the tax benefits when you put the money into the sponsoring organization, and then you decide whether or when it comes out. The next slide, please. DAFs are also very popular for the sponsoring organizations and for financial advisors because they continue to get management fees for funds that are set aside in the DAF. Of course, the problem is that this sets up a contrary interest to getting the money out to charities, right? Because if you're a financial advisor and you're advising your client, you would rather that they leave the funds in the DAF and you continue to get management fees than that the money come out and actually be put to work in a food bank or other charitable organization. Next slide. Okay, so these combined benefits for donors and sponsoring organizations have fueled the extraordinary growth of DAFs. Now, as I mentioned, there has really been explosive growth if we look since 1991, and we'll see this in a chart later on. We have slides that are from 2007 because National Philanthropic Trust has been collecting data since then, and that's been our most comprehensive source for information. So let's take a look at what's happened since 2007, which is just about, 14 years ago. Okay, so contributions back then were around $10 billion, right? Dipping to 78, 98, 10 billion. And then beginning in the last 10 years, they start to grow 178 billion. And now look where they are, $738 billion. Okay, this is extraordinary growth. And there's no reason to think that this is going to be leveling off now. So we have more and more money going into donor advised funds. One of the reasons in the United States for this explosive growth is that donor advised funds are the only way that a donor can retain control over funds and receive maximum tax benefits for something we call complex assets. That's basically property other than publicly traded stock. So if somebody has a private business interest, real estate, cryptocurrency, the only way they can get maximum tax benefits is by giving to a donor advised fund if they want to maintain ongoing control. Next slide. And so we can see what's happened to DAF assets, right? 32 billion in 2007, 234 billion. And look at what's happened in the last since 2018 to 2021, just in the 4 years, 121 billion, 147, 168, 234. I mean, this is really accelerating growth. Well, maybe this is good for society, right? Maybe we have some expanding pie going on. Well, look what's happened to total charitable giving over this past many years. This is from Giving USA. Since 1979, total charitable giving has been pretty consistent at about 2% of disposable income. Disposable income is the amount of money that people have to spend on charitable giving. But look at this. With that explosive growth of DAFs, there has been no increase in charitable giving. In fact, we're kind of at historic low levels at around 1.8% of total giving. So total giving has not increased. This has not been a case of a big expanding pie. We're not adding more dollars. Instead, what we're doing is we are shifting dollars. And this next slide, I think, is particularly valuable and important. I think this is, that's out of the way. Oh, well, I'll talk about this point now. What about this idea that it doesn't matter about money going into donor advised funds because they have such high payout rates? Well, there's a couple of things to say in response. First of all, you have to realize that donor advised funds are getting the same tax benefits as if the money was going directly to a charity. So 100%, basically, we should be comparing this to a 100% payout rate because they are getting these maximum tax benefits, at least in the United States. Donor advised funds on average have numbers that say, oh, we're on average paying about, it varies and there's lots of complexity, but it's somewhere around 20%, 25%. And they say, so what's the problem? Because we have such high payout rates on average, they're so much higher than foundations. But the point is that averages can hide a lot of ills. We don't say that because the Gates Foundation is a time-limited foundation, that no other foundation needs to have any payout requirements, right? It's silly to average the different DAF accounts and treat them as a whole. That's not how our tax rules should work. The other thing is that we know that a lot of people use donor advised funds to fund their annual giving of appreciated property. And all you need is for 20% of those funds to be that type of annual money in, money out. And then you could say, then none of the other 80% needs to spend anything at all. That doesn't make any sense at all. So fast payout by some accounts should not allow no payout by others. Next slide. So the amount currently set aside in private foundations and donor advised funds, these are intermediary and organizations, is $1.4 trillion. It's a lot of money. And the problem is that they're not subject to any rules. Is there a slide that shows the, Amy, do we have the slide that showed the graph about the growing amount of money going into? Is that, keep going back, let's see. I thought, there it was. That was the slide that I wanted us to see. Sorry. Here's the important thing to see when we talk about, so we said that the total amount of charitable giving has remained flat. Right now it's 1.85% of charitable giving, but look at what has happened. Back in 1991, which is when Fidelity Charitable started before the rise of DAFs, 5%, this is the blue line on the left, 5% of total charitable giving went to private foundations and donor advised funds. 95% went directly to charities. Now look at what has happened. As I said, we only have the donor advised fund data since 2007, so we added the private foundation data since then. Look at that. Today, 37% of this fixed pie is now going to private foundations and donor advised funds. And as I mentioned, we know that donor advised funds have no payout rules, but also the way the rules work, private foundations now also have no payout rules. In the United States, we have a 5% payout rule for private foundations, but private foundations can meet their payout obligation or avoid it by giving to a donor advised fund. That counts the same. Remember, we said it's treated the exact same as an outright gift to charity. And so we have all this money, this $1.4 trillion set aside, subject to no payout rules at all. And by the way, these funds have afforded tremendous tax benefits to the donors, which has depleted tax revenue, because these donations, a well-planned gift can save as much as 74% of the value of the gift in taxes in the United States. So a $10 million donation can cost the government $7.4 million in foregone tax revenue, and only the donor $2.6 million. So it's critically important when we give up so much money that we make sure that this money is actually going to get to charity. Now we can move back ahead to where we were. So as I said, the concerns is about whether these funds would ever be put to charitable use. And the reason is because private foundations can hide their charitable activities and avoid payout rules by giving to DAFs. And as a result, there's no assurance that DAFs and private foundation funds will ever be given to charity. Next question. Okay. And there's a question I see, which maybe I'll leave to Andrew so that he can keep our time going.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Ray. Yeah, we'll get to that one then during the Q&A. I just wanted to ask you first before we move on. You mentioned one of the kind of the real sticking points of this is the problem with payouts, and that when it sits in this account, it's like a big cardboard box almost for forever and ever, or can do. Yeah. But presumably the donors only get a one-time tax benefit, so it doesn't matter to them if it gets paid out in 12 months or 10 years.
That's right.
So is the real villain of the piece therefore that really the sort of the hosting, the sponsoring organization here?
Well, I think that when you say it doesn't make any difference to the donor about when they pay it out, I actually don't think that's true. I think that one of the really underappreciated things, one of the underappreciated points is the value of the capacity to control charitable wealth. I think that there's a myth of like, why would they care? They've given it away. They can't use it to buy a yacht. But I mean, very rich people and even regular people like the ability to make charitable donations and to control. And for the very wealthy, of course, it affords a lot of power beyond just the warm glow of the charitable giving, right? You give, and you get legacy admissions, you get special treatment in hospitals, you get abilities to make business and social connections. It affords a lot of soft power. So the ability to control charitable wealth is something that people want to preserve. They would rather have control as humans. You know, the desire to be able to control wealth is a natural human desire. So I think the problem is that the tax rules used to say, the tax rules still say, but they no longer apply, that donors, in order to get tax benefits, you have to give up complete dominion and control, because we know that's the hard thing for people to do. And what the DAF does is it undoes that. Now you get the tax benefits, but you can retain dominion and control through these advisory privileges.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Ray. I've got more questions for you, but I'd like to move on to bring Becky in now. So our third panelist is Becky Asiimwe. Becky is a member of Alliance's editorial advisory board and is the director of the Centre on African Philanthropy and Social Investment, and adjunct professor at Wits Business School, Wits University in South Africa. He's a writer, researcher and thought leader with a keen interest in questions of African resources, democracy and governance. He's also the guest editor for this edition of Alliance. So Becky, what's been your experience of being the guest editor? What have you taken away from that in terms of new tools and vehicles?
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you for organizing this panel and putting together a huge community drawn from across the world. So I want to thank Alliance Magazine, yourself, Charles, and everyone for really allowing me to guest edit this issue. It's a topic that is very close to my heart. Usually when talking about something new, we are quick to start thinking, what's actually new about this? Is it a case of new bottle, old wine, new wine in old bottles? And as one of my mentors said, there's really nothing new here. It is a case of, putting the same old wine in a new bottle. It still tastes the same. And in fact, it could even be tasting horribly so. But honestly speaking, I mean, guest editing this issue was so insightful for me, because I could immediately see a lot of issues emerging based on what maybe Jackie was talking about in relation to context. So what's something that could be a novelty in one region, and Andrew, you write about this in the magazine yourself. What could be a novelty in one region or in one context could actually be an old tradition elsewhere. If I'm to borrow from the field of climate change and resilience today, a lot of what is being introduced now as new tools and ways of dealing with issues of climate change, mitigation, adaptation, among others, are things that some regions used to do long time ago. I give you an example. There's this whole new notion around drying of food as part of mitigating some of the effects of climate change. It's something that big international institutions focusing on climate change are actually introducing in their programming. But communities in Africa, for example, this is how they've always done stuff. They've always dried their food. It's not something that is new to them, but that's something that is being propagated as new today. Equally, if you look at issues of biodiversity, issues of conservation, especially at community levels, again in the South, mainly in Africa, communities have always made sure that they take into account issues of conserving the forests, the lands, the rivers, among others, because they've always known that there will be some effects that if this is not done would happen. But this is something that is presented as new today by big international organizations. So this is really to say what could be new in one place could actually be something that has been a long tradition elsewhere. And what is an old tradition elsewhere and probably no longer effective could actually prove to be something that is required and new and needed in a new context. And so endowments, for example, were very difficult in the past to operationalize in Africa. A lot of institutions tried to do this, but the context and the timing did not really make it relevant at that time. But these were already popular in the global north. Today, we actually are sitting in Africa with lots and lots of institutions going towards building and establishing endowments. And so that could be seen as something new in the African context, but actually it's not new because it has always been done elsewhere. It's just that it wasn't maybe relevant then, it is relevant now. Social impact bonds are in the increase in the global south, but not everywhere in the global south. If you go to Hong Kong, for example, if you read the interview that we did with the RS group, social impact bonds are not popular. They've tried them, they did not work. But what works there is blended finance. And so again, what this says to me is that we probably need to think about, and I tried in my editorial to capture this using two concepts. One is the concept of variable geometry in integration studies, which is really about differentiated speed towards adopting something. In this case, we need to think about differentiated and flexible speeds at which different regions utilize in order to adopt different tools when it comes to giving. Trust-based philanthropy or trust-based giving, and I think this is a new topic, big everywhere, especially in the global north. Most international NGOs and organizations, including donors, are challenged to think about decolonizing philanthropy, adopt trust-based strategies, etc., etc. But if you listen to Jackie, what she was explaining is something that has been done in the African communities is basically trust-based philanthropy, because at the heart of it is the notion of dignity. So that means trust-based philanthropy or giving has always existed in the African continent, and I'm sure in some of the global south context, but it was never framed as trust-based philanthropy. It has always been something that is innate in ways in which people give towards each other or help each other. It's assuming this technical big name today because it's being adopted elsewhere else. And so from that variable geometry perspective, it's okay to actually accept that different regions are going to move at different speeds, at different times, and context will dictate at what point they need to adopt a particular tool. But the other is also a concept of subsidiarity, which also says you have to choose tools that are as close as possible to those who are concerned. And so this is something to do with cultural relevance that Jackie was speaking about. Now, if you look at the issue, two schools basically emerge in the issue that we have just published. The one school is what I think my colleague has just spoken about, marked of, challenging the notion of donor-advised funds and the extent to which they are presented as effective. And so that's one school that you'll probably see in the magazine in terms of arguments for or against the adoption of these new tools, one of which is the donor-advised funds. But there's another school that actually sees traditional philanthropy and traditional foundations as outdated, as not sophisticated enough to deal with current challenges and complex issues that the world is confronting, and therefore the need to look out for more innovative, creative ways through which some of these challenges could be dealt with at a larger scale, much faster, without much restrictions. And so the idea of donor-advised funds, the idea of liability limited companies, among others, have actually been suggested as a way of dealing with that. And you will see that that school coming through in the magazine. And I think the proponent of that to be Scott McDonald, who writes eloquently about this. But at the end of the day, really, I go back to where I started. What does this really mean in terms of what we are testing today? Has the taste of the wine really changed, or is still the same taste, but we are presenting recycled bottles or new bottles in articulating the new philanthropic landscape? So Andrew, let me stop there in terms of what I saw coming out. There are other ways and other tools that we spoke about, advisory, family, offices, cryptocurrencies, which already have been written about in the online version of the magazine, and many other informal sets of tools that we did not get the opportunity to write about in the current issue. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Becky. Great point you make that. In your guest editorial, I remember you stressing the idea of the importance of context in determining what giving vehicles will be relevant. What are you seeing in the parts of Africa you're familiar with? What specific forms are you seeing there that are actually taking on and are what you would see as relevant rather than sort of impositions from outside? Are there any one or two you could mention?
Yeah, so for where I sit, especially in the global north, I think that the donor advised funds are probably still a new phenomenon, and they are likely to grow at a very low pace, given maybe the challenges and some of the issues that we are dealing with, but also the regulatory environment. So while there might be an appetite, I don't see them taking off in a big way, but also in a faster speed. However, issues like impact investing, blended finance, the use of technology, especially around cryptocurrencies, are actually on the increase and are likely to take off faster than the other forms, given the uptake of technology, mobile, money, and the ways in which different countries in Africa, for example, Kenya and others, have developed this massive technological platform to allow for new forms of giving. So I see that as something that over the last couple of years, we have seen lots of movement on impact investing, the creation of social impact bonds, venture philanthropy. So that is really something that the continent has woken up to. But equally so, the continent is still very much, in many ways, improving and updating some of the informal and what could be called traditional ways of doing things, which is, I think, is at the heart of what Jackie was talking about. When you give in the continent, you have to give in such a way that does not put yourself as the person that knows it all, but you have to really be dependent on what the communities themselves want, and how they want to be treated. And so the idea of philanthropy advisors, which is what Jackie's company does now, is something that might also grow in the continent, because a lot of international donors, including international NGOs, are finding themselves in a bit of a challenge, because they've got to adopt this new form of decolonizing philanthropy, trust-based philanthropy, but they might not know how to do that. And in order to do it well, they will need to collaborate with some of these philanthropy advisors and some of the locally based infrastructure organizations.
Thanks, Becky. Let me move to the Q&A and the chat, on the Slido, I should say. Ray, there's a question here specifically for you. It's from Gina Rothstein. How do you see the intergenerational wealth transfer affecting the DAF market compared to the private foundation market? Is this also leading to the growth of DAFs? Ray, what's your take on that?
I think that it's definitely the intergenerational wealth transfer right now is definitely going to result in more money in both DAFs and private foundations. So I don't think it's clear which way it's going to which way it's going to go. A lot of it has to do with the fact that a lot of giving actually occurs during life because of in the United States, the ability to have multiple tax savings if you transfer during life as opposed to at death. But certainly what we now have is, with this growing amounts of wealth, and particularly the amount of wealth controlled by the super wealthy, we're going to see more and more money set aside in philanthropy in order to avoid estate and gift taxes and other taxes. And because there's all of our centy billionaires and billionaires are all, committing their money for the public good and thereby avoiding taxes. So we're going to see a huge growth in these areas, or the growth continuing.
Right, thanks, Ray. Jackie, can I bring you in at this point, just to because Civ Fund is a sort of, in a sense, a bit like a DAF, and it's a fiscal hosting organization for other donors. How do you react to the sort of the US situation that Ray's just described? And are you aware of that sort of danger, and what do you do to meet it?
Sorry, Andrew, the danger of what? Just repeat
The
for me.
danger of
Thank you.
sitting on money and keeping it just keep it in this big pot
Oh,
and using the sort of.
I get
I
so
mean,
exactly.
what's the regulation is, I guess, is what I'm asking in terms
Ah.
of that sort of.
So we are a new player in this field. CivSource itself is 5 years old, coming to 6 in October this year, and Civ Fund, which is our grant making and fiscal host facility, is about 4 years old. And our fiscal hosting experience is about 3 years old. So we are really new players in this space. One of the things that we committed to as Civ's Fund is to say money will not sit. It comes to do work. So it's literally for us a conveyor belt in terms of enabling the work to happen. Two, remember that I talked about context. Context matters. Sadly, where we are situated, you cannot hold large pots of money without raising certain eyebrows, for good or for bad, right? It is what it is. We that's our context, and so we would not have a situation where we're having large pots of money sitting on our accounts. It's not safe for us. It's not safe for our partners.
Right, thank you. But DAFs has been very popular at the moment. So, Ray, coming to you again. A question from Barbara Leopold. Thanks for the nuance to growth of DAFs. Both you and Andrew mentioned the benefit of DAFs to holding organizations. Can you confirm that it is the holding organizations that continue to earn from investments on DAF dollars, while benefits of dollars is more about the soft power you mentioned?
I guess I don't fully understand the question. I mean, I think that, could you explain? I don't quite understand.
I guess she means that the people who get the money out of managing DAFs are the holding organizations. Well, the actual benefits from on the donor side is that they maintain that soft power.
Well, I think, I mean, as a factual matter, I would say that's true, right? You get so the fees for managing the funds go to the sponsoring organizations. And I think there are other reasons that when charities themselves are involved as sponsors, I think they get something very powerful for them, which is that an ability to know which of their donors have resources that could be put to their charitable use. So there is also, when you're talking about actual charities, working charities that sponsor DAFs, as opposed to financial institutions that sponsor DAFs. Financial institutions that sponsor DAFs have no particular charitable mission. They say their mission is to benefit the world, but I mean, and when somebody has a mission to do everything, it's often a mission to do nothing. So I think that, but when you have specific charities that host them as sponsoring organizations, then what it does is it recognizes that they see that certain donors have a lot of money and they can encourage them to give for their mission. So I think there's also that value too for charities to sponsor DAFs.
Okay. I've got a question for which I'd like to put to all of you, actually. And we've been talking a lot about innovation, which is clearly important in philanthropy. Jackie mentioned it earlier, we have to keep sort of morphing and innovating. But is there a danger we'll kind of fixate on novelty? I mean, innovation doesn't always mean progress. Ballpoint pens are worse than fountain pens in many respects. Are we neglecting existing means of giving, which if developed might be more fruitful just in the pursuit of novelty? Any thoughts on that?
I don't think it's either or. I think it's both and. And I think the beauty of philanthropy is its power to experiment. And like Becky was saying, if certain tools don't work, we don't, we don't hop on them. We leave them aside and create newer tools. So I think it's both and. I don't think it's either or. And so the ability to adapt, to take risks, to experiment, to strengthen what works, because sometimes innovating isn't even creating new, it's recreating or tweaking what is already working. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay.
Oh, I'd say my concern is that when we're talking about tax benefits for philanthropy, we're really talking about an allocation of power between donors and charities. That's what the tax rules are designed to do. And our fundamental rules in the United States that were enacted in 1969 did a good job of protecting charities to make sure that there was a connection between charitable tax benefits and benefits for charities. And what's happened now is that the interests of the wealthy and those who protect the interests of the wealthy, right, financial institutions and things like that, have severed these two, and they're saying, we're going to give all the charitable tax benefits, we're giving all the goods, but we're not making sure that the society is benefiting. And that's where the real problem lay. It's not about somebody saying like, hey, what can we produce the most good for? It's good for whom? Is it good for donors or good for charities? And I think my co-panelists here are very concerned with and have highlighted a lot of interesting and important aspects of how one maximizes good for the charities. But what I'm concerned about in the United States is how the rules have instead been oriented to the interests of the wealthy donors to give them maximum tax benefits and minimum obligations.
So, Ray, just very briefly, can you? We've talked a lot about the critical aspects of DAFs. Could you enumerate the sort of virtues as far as charities are concerned?
As far as charities are concerned?
Yeah.
I mean,
we know what's good for donors and why they're good for donors, but is it better?
Yeah. Well, I think the problem is from charities is that it would be good for charities if it in fact expanded the pie, but there's no evidence that it's expanded the pie. I think that the best thing one can say is it is useful in terms of donors who want to give things like cryptocurrency and business interests. It gives them maximum tax benefits. The charity doesn't have to take it directly because the DAF sponsor serves as an entity that can take the property and sell it. So that's an advantage for the charitable world. The problem is, of course, is that it's taking tax benefits that were supposed to only be available for funds that go directly to charities, and they're allowing the donor to have it not go to charities. I think if the rules were adopted that said that charities are going to get the money either within 15 years or perhaps under a 5% payout rule, then it would be fine. Donor advised funds would be fine. The problem is the fact that they don't have any payout obligation and that they allow private foundations to avoid their payout obligation.
Thanks. That's pretty good summing up. We're nearly out of time, unfortunately. Can I come to both Becky and Jackie for their kind of last thoughts? Becky, can I come to you first? Anything you take away from this discussion, or anything that stands out from the whole topic of new giving vehicles and tools?
No, thank you, Andrew. I think for me, I mean, the takeaway point is probably the question on innovation. And I would probably end by saying that we always innovate on something that is existence. So if you take an example of maybe linking to Jackie's point around not, keeping the money when it comes through, our context here, if you look at the Black Feminist Fund, for example, what they've done is to come up with a system that could potentially look like a quasi-endowment, because the context actually suggests that you cannot keep a lot of money, especially when there are so many problems affecting especially women's movements. So you receive the money and you need to pass it to other organizations. So if you are then thinking of innovating on an instrument like the endowment, you cannot treat it as a normal endowment. You probably have to think of a quasi-endowment where part of the money comes in, you keep it, but the rest of the money goes out at different windows, so that the system does not hoard money, but it allows for the resolution of the challenges that the context might present at that particular moment. So that could be a form of innovation in a way, but it doesn't mean you have created something completely new. It simply means you have taken a tool, thought about it, and innovated around it so that it meets the requirements of the context. And I think that's really the spirit of what's coming out if I'm to look holistically at all the articles in the magazine. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Becky. Jackie, can I just come to you for your kind of final reactions?
I think really what I take from our conversation today is context is king. So, and understanding that then enables us to ensure that wherever and however and whenever philanthropic resources are deployed, that they actually advance good, which is what we're trying to do, but based on context. And maybe there are things that we do need to start changing about the context, and that's where advocacy comes in. So those are my last reflections from today.
Great, thanks very much to all three of you. We're virtually out of time now. I hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. If you have done, don't forget to use the link in the chat to take advantage of the 20% discount to subscribe to Alliance, again using the code TOOLS23. I'd like to end by saying thanks really to everyone who's taken part, to our expert panelists, wonderful panelists, to Optimi for sponsoring today's event and enable us to keep it free. Thanks, Christoph, and your team. And to the Alliance team as well, and especially Emma McGoldrick, who's sort of managed the logistics for the whole event. And most of all, thanks to all of you for taking part. Our event series continues as early as next week with the Wings Philanthropy Transformation Initiative. There's a link to that in the chat or in the Slido, and you'll also receive an invite to it shortly in your inboxes if you register for this one. Okay, once again, thanks to all involved, and goodbye to all.